Hello, my name is Jalon Hill. I'm a reporter for QCity Metro, and today I'm here at First Baptist Church West, one of the oldest black churches here in Charlotte. The location we're at today on Oakline Avenue has some historical ties to one of Charlotte's black icons, Harvey B. Gantt. Harvey B. Gantt is known as a politician, being Charlotte's first black mayor, but before that, he was an architect. And at 33 years old, he was tasked with designing this church. But instead of using a traditional approach, a traditional design, he went for a more contemporary structure, setting the standard for churches later on down the line. The African American Cultural Heritage Fund announced they would be providing grant money to First Baptist Church West to preserve the historical site. I had a chance to sit down with Mr. Gantt, talk about how he planned out the structure, what his favorite part was, and what it means that his site has stood the test of time. So I know when you first came in, you were admiring the building, admiring the project that you worked on, and so, tell me what year did this become presented to you to, work on this church?
Well, we had formed the architectural firm Gantt Huberman in 1971, and there were some folks in this church that were very nice to me that I got to know as a young architect, even prior to my going away to graduate school. When I formed the firm in 1971, one of our aspirations was that we wanted to do a range of things, not limited to the kinds of things that African American architects are often tasked to do, as affordable housing, primarily single family homes, but never any of the bigger institutions like churches and schools and office buildings. So our goal was to do those kinds of projects that normally fall under the purview of architectural design. So when the First Baptist Church put out a notice around 1974, they were looking for an architect. We went and said, let's go interview for that project. And of course we were up against predominantly white firms because there were no other black firms in the area. And we had some very nice people who served on the selection committee that listened carefully, because we didn't have a lot of projects at that point. Our firm was no more than 3 years old. And so we couldn't show a bunch of churches because we had no churches. But we talked about our willingness to listen, our willingness to try to deal with the program of spaces that they needed, and the fact that we might give them an iconic design, not the standard design that usually churches have, 4 columns out front and steeple on the top and A-frame roof and things of that nature.
So tell me about that design. What made it so special to you that you decided to go that route instead of the traditional route?
Well, first of all, you had to have the client accept it. We actually presented to them, as I recall, and this was some time ago, of course, we had this particular scheme that was what we called the contemporary approach. This was scheme number 2. Scheme number 1 was a basic traditional design, because the church, when it was downtown in the, I believe, 3rd Ward area, was a very traditional church, which you expected to have red brick, columns out front. And we had a number of people in the congregation who wanted us to replicate that. Of course, with a little bit more modern theme, but with modern conveniences. And so we, to satisfy them as a young, hungry firm like we were, we said, let's show them this approach. We built a model of it. And then let's then show them scheme 2, which was essentially this design, which was to be a swooping sanctuary that looked to an apex, to this pulpit, sloping roof, big steeple out front, not 4 columns, but 4 piers that created the look. And we showed them this, and we tried to tell them this would be something that would be very different. And they told us they'd have to think about it. I think something of that nature, people like Miss Mildred Aldridge and some of the other leaders of the committee said, we'll think about it and get back to you. And of course, we were already excited because they had chosen us over the other firms. So they were already making a commitment that said, we're going to go down the road with this African-American firm. And to our great surprise, they came back and said, you know what? We're going to go with the contemporary look, you know. And we jumped to the ceiling. We said, thank you. And I remember telling one member, I think it was Mr. Hurd, that you will not regret this decision. And that was it. The rest is history.
Oh. So how long was that planning process to put it all together so they can see the final result?
Well, in design, you have to go from the schematic, that is the design approach, which essentially was this type of space, sketches, drawings, to specific construction documents. And that phase takes about a year. So we took about a year going through this until we finally ended up with a set of drawings that thick that outlined what was going to happen. Then we had to bid it to see whether or not the church could afford it. Because one of the things we kept toying with was the idea, my gosh, this is new. A lot of contractors are not used to these kinds of buildings, these big heavy beams, you know, all that stuff is pretty expensive. So we tried to do other things to cut costs in some places. But we always said this space was the premier space, and then if we had to cut corners, so to speak, we would have much simpler kinds of things occurring in the rear of the offices and other kinds of stuff that was there. When the bids came in, we held our breath, came in a little bit over the budget. We honed the budget a little bit, but we kept the design.
And if you can go back, how much was the final cost, if you can remember?
No, I can't. It was something under $1 million back. But now you're talking about 1975, 76, which would be the equivalent today of $7 or $8 million.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's 50 years ago. Which is one of the things I want to say about this is that we did a contemporary design, and here we are now. This church has been granted this opportunity to do some things on what would be called an historic preservation. A modernist building that has lasted 50 years ago, and for me, that's the badge of honor. But that 50 years later, we're looking at a building that still services the original needs, and yet has been recognized and awarded because of the ingenuity of church members, I guess, to get this grant from the National Historic Preservation Group that gave the grant.
Oh. And so tell me, you have a favorite part of the structure that you look at and say,
This is the favorite.
The very favorite part.
This room still evokes some awe. People walk through the doors and come in, and the stained glass windows filtering light through gives it the sacred quality of a cathedral. That's always been my mantra in terms of design of churches. I don't think churches ought to look like theaters. That's what a lot of architects are doing today. They design a big box and put a lectern or a pulpit up front, and that's it. I think I've studied the cathedrals of medieval times and what makes those work. Having been in those spaces in Europe, and what makes them work is the mystique associated with coming into a facility and the kinds of feelings it evokes when people come into a space where light is filtered through stained glass. The stained glass is contemporary in its form, and there's some symbolism associated with it. But it is the light that comes in that does this. In the morning it comes from that area, in the evenings it comes in on the other side. The steeple out front, the bell tower, evokes and says, this is where we are. That's the whole purpose of it. The entrance ought to be special, but it ought not to be so overwhelming that it, in fact, takes away from the interior space. And then the mystique of light coming up top that you can't see, but you know there's something up there happening. That's the skylights. You can't even see those windows unless you get way back from the building. You say, oh my God, that's how that light occurs. And so it's the mystique of the space that makes it. Well, you go into a medieval cathedral, and this mystique of the space evokes a feeling of your smallness to something bigger and more powerful than you are. And that's God. That's what we architects try to achieve. And I think in this relatively small space when compared to cathedrals, I think we succeeded.
And so I meant to ask you, are you a man of faith as well?
Yes, I am.
And so what emotional attachment do you have to, when it comes to designing churches?
Well, obviously, it's a special space. We're going there to worship Him, Christ.
Yeah.
It's a belief in a higher power than we are. The space ought not to be mundane. It ought to be memorable. It ought to evoke a certain feeling, even if you're not a Christian. And I brought a lot of people into this church who are not people of faith. But even they remark, my goodness, it feels like I've been in a church, a space. And that's the beginning of how you can reach your inner self and be in this space. And that's what's always been important to me.
So when you first walked in, you were in awe of your own work. And so tell me about those emotions. You know, what did you feel?
No, it's easy. Most architects would have these same emotions. Every time you walk in the door of a facility you designed that was memorable, you want to see if you still have that same feeling about the space. And every time I walk in the doors for this church, it reminds me of when I was talking about that swooping design and how it works. So when I walked in the door, I still had the same feelings I did the morning that they dedicated this church. You can't understand that. It's difficult for me to describe that. I tease my lawyer friends because I said, you know what? The one thing about being an architect is when you make a mistake, you can see it all the time. If the design didn't work, you can see it. When you guys make a mistake as lawyers, somebody either goes to jail or they have to pay a lot of money, but even when you're successful as lawyers, it's just a bunch of papers and then maybe an award or something like that. For an architect, I can take my grandchildren around and show them the building, and that's much more exciting than paper. Not saying their work is not important, please don't get me wrong on that. What I'm saying is I've always loved the notion that I can go back and see my successes and some of my failures.
So you designed this church here when you were 32.
32, 33, somewhere around there.
And so, you're 80 years old now, correct?
That's correct.
So how did you over the years change as an architect from this time period?
Well, I obviously grew from the young age of 30-somethings. And that's what you want. You want to do in every profession. You get better at doing things. And that things you don't even recognize or wouldn't think about in terms of design. We detail the buildings better over the years. That is, things you might not think about. Does the roof leak? Do the walls stand up? Are we building it on solid foundations? There's an interesting story about this facility. When we started designing it and studying the soil here, we found out that right about here, right about where the pulpit is, there was a stream that ran right below that was there years ago that nobody saw. But when we did soil test analysis, we found out that if we built right here without reinforcing the foundation, the church would, over the years, these walls would start cracking. And we took that back to the committee, and they said, how much is it going to cost? And it did. It cost, for back then, a gargantuan amount of money. But I kept saying, your church will last a lot longer. We can't build it here unless you fix that portion of the side. I know that's very technical, but that's how you grow over the years. You begin to look for things like that make your buildings last. And what has happened for me is, in fact, I made this comment to some folks a few days ago. One of the things that I'm proudest of our firm, which grew to about 55 architects and professionals, is that none of our buildings have yet been torn down. Most of them are still, all of them, as far as I know, are still serviceable. And perhaps the first one that's going to be torn down to be replaced by a new facility is the Charlotte Transportation Center. It would be the first building that we design that's going to be taken down. So over the years, we prided ourselves on saying, we have designed buildings that last. You know, they're not perfect buildings. We always have to go back and tweak some things, but we got better at it as our years practicing architecture got better and better.
And so, looking back, what advice would you give yourself during that time period, in your early 30s, doing this project? What advice would you offer yourself that you?
What would I say to myself? That's a tough one to answer. Something I said earlier to some other folks: be true to yourself. Remember what your goals were when you formed the firm. Those goals were to design in a creative and innovative fashion. And if I was still practicing today, that would still be a mantra. That would be still something I'd care about. Design to meet the client's needs, not your ego, but to meet the client's needs. We met this church's requirements in terms of the size of the facility, the budgets they had, et cetera, and to make sure that you are creating memorable spaces that people will remember when they go in. And most of our buildings, we sought to achieve those goals. No matter what you refer to, if you think of the UNC Charlotte downtown design, most people say, yep, we remember that building, that twists and turns as it goes up. Imaginon, oh yeah, we'll remember that building. We want something that's memorable that people think about.
So tell me, how did you first hear about the grant to preserve this historic site here in Charlotte?
Reverend Woods called me. Dr. Woods called me up and said, we just got a $150,000 grant from essentially the National Trust for Historic Preservation. There's a branch of that was giving those grants out. And what was interesting to me is that I used to serve on that board years and years ago when there was a push among some of us to recognize and preserve the structures from slave quarters to churches, and that we needed to give recognition to another era, another time. At the time, I was a part of that, and that was many, many years ago, so there's no conflict between what has happened here and my serving on that board back in the late 20th century, in the first 5 years of this century. I knew that they were going to make an effort to try to do that. And over the years, I've seen them give grants to, but I was shocked when Dr. Woods called me up and said, guess what? Your church won. I wasn't thinking of this in terms of the traditional historic property. From my mindset, this was still an iconic modern situation. But the definition that the group gives to modern or to a facility that can be recognized is you had to be about 50 years old. And that's when I thought about the fact that, First Baptist is about that age, and made me feel very good about this facility being where it is.
So can you tell me some of the other churches here in Charlotte that have kind of used that same structure from First Baptist West?
So maybe other, I don't want to get on, I don't want to be presumptuous about other architects and what inspired them to emulate parts of this facility, but we do see lots of churches now with stained glass windows in the contemporary fashion. Speaking to the period that we tried to evoke in these windows. On the other hand, I have built on the success of this church led me to St. Luke, which is a church that we designed, and ultimately to Friendship, which is a much bigger church, but there are elements of the Friendship design that were in fact achieved because of the inspiration of this particular church that we'd done. And we did Friendship almost 30 years later. Almost 30 years later. We've done churches in Durham, churches in Gastonia, churches in Columbia, and they all, if you go into them, you will know that they are Harvey Gantt type churches. And you see a theme that keeps being reflected.
And how does that feel for you, seeing your work just constantly being used again, you say?
I feel good. I retired in 2015, and it's kind of nice. Most people know my firm has won design awards before for all kinds of facilities, Imaginon, that we know here in Charlotte, and the Transportation Center, and other kinds of facilities. But most people in Charlotte don't know much about Harvey Gantt, the architect, as much as they know about Harvey Gantt, the politician. And that's what people always say. Well, he's the politician over there. And it kind of hurts that they don't remember that I used to design buildings, and I take that very seriously. My mother would say, that's what I want you to be recognized for. We spent all the money for you to get an education and not for you to be a politician. Although it's nice that you did those things, but it does feel good when we are recognized again for our work. Because even when we win design awards, the only people that know about those are the people who care about designs as much. That's other architects or other people who are in those, who comment on those areas. But the general public doesn't. So this church being recognized for that may allow more people to say, oh, well, they did a little bit more than just stand up before the Charlotte City Council or run against Jesse Helms or whatever.
Thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. It's an honor to be able to speak with you, sit down with you, get my questions answered as well.
My pleasure.